Have you ever walked into a room where you knew you belonged, only to have every eye tell you that you were a mistake? First class, Flight 287. The hum of the jet fades as a supervisor leans over a black man in a sharp black suit. Seat 1A. Rashad Coleman, CEO, billionaire, self-made. But none of that mattered. The supervisor's voice slices through the silence. Sir, that seat belongs to someone more important. The air goes cold. Glasses stop clinking. Dozens of phones rise, recording the moment a man's worth is put on trial mid-air. Rashad doesn't argue. He just stays, calm, too calm, as he stands, buttons his jacket, and whispers, "Then let's make sure this is the move you really want to make." In that second, no one knew. The man they tried to move could move everything. So I'll ask you again. What would you do if your success wasn't enough to buy you respect? Before we continue, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches you, make sure you subscribe because tomorrow, I have saved something extra special for you. The morning it started with the quiet hum of ambition. Rashad Coleman wasn't just another passenger. He was the Rashad Coleman, CEO of Next Tech Systems, a $2 billion tech firm he'd built from the ground up. The NASDAQ bell he'd rung 6 years prior still echoed in the halls of an industry that rarely made room for men who looked like him. On this flight, in this seat, 1A, his preferred corner of solitude in the sky, he was finalizing a presentation. Not just any presentation. This was a key to a $400 million joint venture, a deal that would redefine his company's legacy. The world outside the airplane window was a blur of ground crew and baggage carts, but inside his mind, it was all numbers, projections, and strategy. He was in the zone, a state of deep focus that had carried him through boardrooms and investor meetings where he was always the only one. Then, the bubble burst. A voice, sharp and laced with an unearned authority, cut through his concentration. "Sir, I'm gonna need you to move." Rashad looked up from his tablet. A young male flight attendant stood over him, his posture rigid, his smile a thin, dismissive line. He looked barely old enough to serve drinks, yet his tone was that of a warden. "Excuse me," Rashad asked, his voice even. "That seat is reserved for a VIP passenger," the attendant said, louder this time, as if Rashad's hearing were the issue. "We need you to relocate." The cabin, which had been a low murmur of quiet conversations and rustling papers, began to fall silent. Rows of luxury seats, designed for comfort and privacy, suddenly felt like invisible cages where stares judged more than words. A woman across the aisle lowered her fashion magazine. The man behind him paused his movie. Rashad felt the shift, the subtle but unmistakable transformation from anonymous passenger to public spectacle. He held up his boarding pass, the paper a crisp, undeniable proof of his right to be there. "This is my assigned seat. 1A. The flight attendant glanced at the ticket but didn't truly see it. To him, the paper was irrelevant. The man holding it was the problem. "Sir," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I think you misunderstand how first-class boarding works. Sometimes, operational necessities require us to make adjustments." The corporate jargon was a shield. Operational necessity. A clean, sterile phrase for something ugly and deeply personal. Rashad knew exactly what it meant. It meant his ticket, his status, his very presence, were the adjustments being made. The man was accusing him not just of being in the wrong seat, but of not understanding the world he was in. He was being told, in the politest way possible, that he didn't belong. Before Rashad could respond, a second attendant, a woman this time, glided over. She leaned in, whispering to her colleague but speaking loud enough for the first few rows to hear. "Just handle it. Don't make a scene." The blame was already placed on him. His refusal to simply disappear was the scene. His quiet defiance was the disruption. Rashad's calm was a stark contrast to their flustered agitation. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved. He was a rock against which their prejudice was breaking. The first attendant, emboldened by his colleague, pressed again. "So, for the final time, I need you to stand up so we can seat our VIP." The word hung in the air. VIP. More important person. The implication was clear. and Rashad Coleman was not it. A white couple a few rows back exchanged a knowing glance, a little smirk playing on the husband's lips. A phone, then another, was discreetly raised, the small red recording light a glaring indictment of the moment. Someone in the back muttered, just loud enough to be heard in the thickening silence, "Here we go again." The phrase landed like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a cliché, a stereotype playing out in real time, and he was the unwilling star. When it became clear Rashad would not be moved by words alone, the attendant made the call. A supervisor, the cabin chief, appeared moments later. He was an older man, his uniform immaculate, his face a mask of practiced corporate empathy that didn't quite reach his eyes. He didn't ask for Rashad's side of the story. He didn't ask to see the boarding pass. He arrived with a verdict already in hand. "So," the supervisor began, his voice smooth but firm, "we need to resolve this. My attendant has asked you to move. We have a very important passenger waiting to board, and for the sake of an on-time departure, I must insist you comply immediately." This was the final escalation, the system closing ranks. From one attendant's bias to the entire crew's enforcement. There was no appeal. There was no misunderstanding. This was a decision. Rashad looked from the supervisor's cold eyes to the young attendant's nervous smirk, and he finally understood. This wasn't about his seat. It was about his face. It was about their shock that a man like him could be sitting in 1A, on his own merit, without apology. He let the silence stretch, forcing them to stand in the weight of their demand. He looked past them, at the faces of the other passengers, some looking away in discomfort, others watching with morbid curiosity. No one spoke up. No one intervened. Their silence was its own form of complicity. Finally, Rashad directed a question to the supervisor, his tone controlled but as sharp and cold as polished steel. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice cutting through the cabin. "You're saying I don't belong here." The supervisor didn't flinch. He saw a problem to be managed, not a man to be respected. He delivered the line that would seal the airline's fate. "I'm saying," he replied, with chilling finality, "that seat belongs to someone more important." The air went thick with humiliation. The words echoed in the dead quiet of the cabin. Rashad held the supervisor's gaze for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace that defied the ugliness of the moment, he stood. He didn't stumble. He didn't rush. He rose to his full height, a commanding presence they had tried so hard to diminish. He carefully buttoned the jacket of his custom suit, the simple gesture an act of reclaiming his dignity. He adjusted his tie. He was not a man being removed. He was a man making a decision. He looked at the 3 crew members standing before him, a united front of corporate policy and personal bias. Then he said, his voice just above a whisper but carrying the weight of an earthquake, "Then let's make sure this is the move you really want to make." He stepped aside, a silent concession that felt more like a warning. The crew breathed a collective, quiet sigh of relief, believing they had won. They saw a man defeated, but as he walked past them, his eyes flickered down to his phone. No one saw it. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, as other passengers pretended to look away, his thumb moved with a swift, deliberate purpose across the screen. A single, unseen action, before the phone went dark. The confrontation was over, but the humiliation hung in the recycled air of the cabin like a thick fog. Rashad sat in a different seat, a few rows back from the one his ticket promised, a silent testament to the crew's victory. They moved about the cabin with forced smiles, trying to smooth over the jagged edges of what had just occurred, their relief palpable. They saw a problem contained, a disruption neutralized. But have you ever seen a storm gather on a perfectly calm day? That's what it felt like watching Rashad. He wasn't defeated. He was coiled. His phone lay face down on the armrest, a dark, silent rectangle that held the secret of the single, unseen action he'd taken moments before. The other passengers, a mix of the corporate elite and the quietly wealthy, had now erected invisible walls. Laptops were opened, headphones were put on. They had witnessed the ugliness, and now they wanted to forget it, to retreat back into the comfort of their own importance. Their silence was a verdict in itself. The incident was closed. But for the crew, It wasn't enough to simply win. The victory had to be sanctified by the highest authority on the vessel. The supervisor, still puffed up with his own managerial courage, had a quiet, deferential word at the cockpit door. It was a gesture that said, "We handled it, but your stamp of approval is needed." The door opened, and the captain emerged. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a symbol of absolute control, his crisp uniform a suit of armor, his silver hair a crown. He didn't address the cabin. His focus was singular, his steps deliberate as he walked down the aisle, the plush carpet softening the sound of his approach. He stopped at Rashad's row, a looming figure of white authority, and leaned in. The other passengers tensed, pretending to be absorbed in their screens but listening to every word. "Sir," the captain said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble designed to intimidate, not de-escalate. "I trust there will be no further disruptions for the remainder of this flight. We run a tight ship here. Are we clear?" It was a masterclass in corporate domination. He wasn't asking for Rashad's side. He was issuing a final warning to the man they had already wronged. The implication was clear. You have been put in your place. Stay there. The humiliation was no longer just about a seat. It was now a formal, recorded part of the flight's order. Rashad felt the stays of everyone around him, felt their judgment, their relief that they weren't the one being reprimanded. How many times had he faced this? The quiet, paternalistic condescension from a man who saw his skin color before he saw his suit, his title, or his intellect. He could have argued. He could have quoted FAA regulations. He could have demanded their names. But that would be performing for them, giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he drew on a lifetime of practiced composure, a stillness forged in countless boardrooms where he was the only one. He simply looked up at the captain, his expression a perfect, unreadable mask, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The captain, satisfied that the hierarchy had been unequivocally restored, gave a curt nod back and retreated to his cockpit. It was in this tense, quiet aftermath that the true VIP finally boarded. Ethan Prescott strode into the first-class cabin with the easy, unchecked confidence of a man who had never been told no in his life. He wore a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than the young flight attendant's monthly salary. The transformation of the crew was immediate and sickening. Their forced, professional smiles blossomed into genuine, fawning grins. Their postures, which had been rigid with authority moments before, now bent in deference. "Mr. Prescott, so wonderful to have you with us," the supervisor gushed, taking his leather carry-on as if it were a sacred artifact. "Can I get you a glass of champagne before we take off?" Prescott waved a dismissive hand. "Just water for now, Mark." He knew their names. It was another subtle assertion of his status. As he was led to his throne, seat 1A, his gaze swept across the cabin and landed on Rashad. There was a flicker of recognition, but not of a business rival. He didn't see the CEO of Nextech, the man whose $400 million deal he was actively trying to sabotage. He saw only what the crew had been conditioned to see, a black man sitting where he shouldn't be, a problem that had, thankfully, been solved. A lazy, dismissive smirk curled on Prescott's lips. It was a look of casual, cruel superiority, a silent confirmation of a worldview where some people are simply worth more than others. It was the kind of look that could ignite a fire in a man's soul. Rashad's composure didn't break. He held Prescott's gaze, his own eyes like chips of obsidian, until the other man, slightly unnerved, looked away. Then Rashad turned his attention to the window, watching the ground crew moving like ants on the tarmac. To everyone else, it looked like a final, quiet surrender. The injustice was complete. The attendants, now buzzing with renewed energy, completed their final checks. The safety video began to play. The heavy cabin door was swung shut, its locking mechanism clicking into place with an ominous sound of finality. It was over. The world was back on its axis. The plane began to push back from the gate, the low rumble of the engines a promise of departure, a promise of leaving this ugly moment behind. And then, the intercom crackled to life, a harsh, electronic sound that sliced through the cabin's restored peace. A nervous, uncertain voice filled the air. It was the lead attendant, and the polished warmth was gone, replaced by a tremor of panic. "Ladies and gentlemen," she stammered, we're experiencing a short, unexpected operational delay. Please remain in your seats." The powerful engines wind down into an unsettling, unnatural silence. Outside the window, the tug that had been pushing them back from the gate abruptly disengaged and pulled away, its flashing yellow light blinking in the morning sun. The plane was no longer moving. It was a dead thing on the tarmac, stranded between the gate and the runway. A wave of confusion rippled through the passengers. Whispers erupted. "What's going on? Did someone get sick?" This wasn't weather. This wasn't air traffic. This was something else, something internal, something wrong. And in his seat, Rashad Coleman didn't look surprised at all. He didn't look concerned. He simply picked up his dark, silent phone, the screen still black, and waited. While Flight 287 sat silent on the tarmac, a different kind of engine was roaring to life. In the digital world, speed is measured in shares and retweets, and outrage is the most powerful fuel of all. Have you ever seen something so wrong, so unjust, that your hands shake with a need to do something? That's what the woman in seat 3B felt. She'd recorded the entire confrontation, her heart pounding with a familiar mix of anger and helplessness. Now, sitting in the confusing silence of the delay, she looked down at the footage on her phone. The calm, dignified black man, the arrogant flight attendant, the supervisor's chilling final words. She typed a simple, explosive caption. "They kicked a black man out of his paid-for first-class seat for a VIP on Atlantic Crest Flight 287. This is happening right now." And with a single tap, she sent it out into the world. The video didn't just circulate, it detonated. Within 10 minutes, it had 1,000 retweets. Within 30, 100,000. By the 1-hour mark, it had surpassed 5 million views. The internet had found its story for the day. Hashtags began to trend, first in Los Angeles, then nationally, #Seat1A, #FlyingWhileblack. They were more than just tags. They were digital battle cries, rallying points for a collective frustration that had been simmering for years. The comment sections became a tidal wave of raw emotion. "Unbelievable in 2025. When does this end?" wrote one user. Another added, "I've seen this look 100 times. It's the 'you don't belong here' stare. My heart breaks for him." The anger was palpable, a shared experience echoing through thousands of individual screens. People who had never met felt a kinship with the silent man in the video, a man whose dignity had been put on public trial. Some comments were cynical, born from exhaustion. Same story, different uniform. The powerful protect their own. But every comment, every share, added another layer of pressure, turning a single act of prejudice into a massive, undeniable cultural moment. The narrative was no longer controlled by the airline. It belonged to the public now, and they were furious. Back at Atlantic Crest Airlines corporate headquarters in New York, the social media team saw the fire ignite. Alarms blared across their monitoring software. Their first instinct wasn't concern, it was containment. A crisis meeting was convened. The words thrown around were cold, corporate, and detached. Optics, mitigation, brand integrity. Within the hour, they released a statement, a masterclass in saying nothing at all. Atlantic Crest Airlines is aware of an onboard misunderstanding on Flight 287. We are committed to providing a safe and respectful experience for all our customers and are currently investigating the incident to ensure all proper procedures were followed. A misunderstanding. Procedures. The words were an insult, a transparent attempt to bury the ugly truth under layers of corporate jargon. The public saw right through it. The statement was screenshot, mocked, and ratioed into oblivion. A misunderstanding. We saw the video. We understood perfectly. One viral reply read. The airline's attempt to control the narrative had backfired spectacularly, adding fuel to an already raging inferno. By noon, the story had jumped from social media to the mainstream. News anchors were discussing it, playing the now viral clip with Rashad's face respectfully blurred. Pundits debated the incident, framing it as a textbook example of modern-day racial bias. The story of Flight 287 was no longer just a tweet. It was a national conversation. And then, The internet detectives went to work. In the high-definition footage, someone noticed the logo on Rashad's briefcase. Others recognized his watch. A reverse image search of a screenshot led them to a tech conference panel from 2 years ago. The blurred face suddenly had a name. Rashad Coleman. And not just any Rashad Coleman. The Rashad Coleman, CEO of Nextech Systems. The revelation changed everything. The story twisted from one of simple injustice to one of profound, almost poetic irony. A quick search of Nextech's corporate clients revealed the bombshell. Their largest aviation contract was with Atlantic Crest Airlines. The man they had humiliated, the man they deemed less important, was the architect of their entire digital ticketing and logistics infrastructure. The irony was so thick, so perfect, it spread like wildfire. They kicked out the man who built their system. A headline on a tech blog screamed. The emotional current of the internet shifted. The anger and shame felt on Rashad's behalf morphed into a thrilling, suspenseful anticipation. He was no longer just a victim. He was a man with immense, hidden power. And through it all, Rashad himself remained completely silent. No statement, no tweet, no comment. His silence became the loudest voice in the conversation, a blank canvas onto which a million people projected their hopes for justice. The question echoed across every platform. What is he going to do? What happens when the man they tried to break holds the power to break them right back? The world was watching, waiting for his next move. But while the public was asking what Rashad would do, a much more urgent question was just beginning to form inside the sterile walls of Atlantic Crest's executive suites. As an IT director stared at a blinking red alert on his screen, a system-wide server disruption he couldn't explain, a senior VP's blood ran cold as he connected the news alerts to the chaos unfolding in his operations hub. They were just realizing who they messed with. Power has a sound. In the boardroom, it's the confident click of a pen. On an A-plane, it's the authoritative voice of a captain. But in the global operations center of Atlantic Crest Airlines, power was supposed to be silence, a vast, dark room where a wall of screens glowed with the steady green of a perfectly running system. A digital heartbeat pumping flights across the globe. But at 11:17 a.m. Eastern Time, the silence was broken. A single red alert blinked on the map over Chicago, then another over Dallas, then a cascade. It wasn't a crash, it was a cessation, a digital freeze. The heartbeat had stopped. The first reaction wasn't panic. It was annoyance. Have you ever seen a king get angry at his throne for being uncomfortable? That was the energy in the room. Executives in $1,000 suits barked at IT directors, demanding answers for what they assumed was a minor glitch. The IT teams, sweating under the pressure, scrambled through lines of code, their faces illuminated by diagnostics that made no sense. It was as if the system's core logic had simply vanished. Ticketing networks worldwide were frozen solid. Boarding passes wouldn't scan. Gates couldn't receive flight data. The entire, intricate dance of modern air travel had come to a dead stop. An hour into the chaos, a junior systems analyst, his face pale, pointed a shaking finger at a diagnostic screen. "It's not our code," he stammered to his boss. "The disruption, it's originating from the core servers, the ones Nextech manages." The name hung in the air for a moment, meaningless to most. But not to David Chen, the senior VP of Public Relations, who had just spent the last 90 minutes in a separate crisis meeting, watching the #flying while black hashtag explode. He'd been staring at blurry screenshots of the man on Flight 287, trying to spin a misunderstanding into something believable. Now, hearing that name, Nextech, a cold, terrifying synapse fired in his brain. The PR crisis and the operational crisis weren't two separate fires. They were the same fire. He stumbled out of the operations center and into the main conference room where the CEO, Alistair Finch, was demanding answers. "What the hell is going on?" Finch roared. "The media is slaughtering us, and our planes can't even move." David Chen didn't speak. He walked to the main monitor, his hands trembling as he typed into the search bar, "CEO of Nextech Systems." Rashad Coleman's official corporate headshot filled the screen. Confident, powerful, impeccably dressed. The man who had rung the NASDAQ bell. The man whose face was now instantly, horrifyingly recognizable. He was the blurred figure from the video. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The silence that followed was heavier and more terrifying than any alarm. They saw it. The man they had dismissed, humiliated, and deemed unimportant was the same man who held the keys to their entire kingdom. The man whose company they paid hundreds of millions of dollars a year to keep their planes in the sky. It wasn't a server malfunction. It was a message. Panic, real panic, erupted. It was no longer controlled or annoyed. It was primal and desperate. Lawyers were shouting into phones about breach of contract, only to be reminded that Nextech likely had an airtight clause for client-initiated security protocols. The PR team, moments ago so confident in their soulless corporate statement, were now staring at a public relations apocalypse from which there was no recovery. They hadn't just created a viral video. They had publicly executed their relationship with their most critical technology partner. While executives were screaming, one of them made a call. Onboard Flight 287, Ethan Prescott, the VIP, was growing impatient with the delay. He'd been sipping champagne, smugly enjoying his victory. Then his satellite phone buzzed with a secure, encrypted call. He answered it, his tone annoyed. "What is it?" He listened for a moment, his brow furrowed. Then his posture changed. The smirk vanished. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly white. The man who had boarded with the arrogance of a king now looked like a ghost. He slowly put the phone down, his hand shaking, and his eyes darted across the cabin until they found Rashad Coleman. He finally saw him. He saw him for who he really was. Rashad saw it all. He watched the flight attendants' confident smiles curdle into nervous, anxious tics as they whispered to each other, getting no information from the cockpit. He watched the other first-class passengers begin to complain, their entitlement turning to frustration. And he watched Ethan Prescott, the man who had smirked at his humiliation, now staring at him with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. The power in the cabin hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. The humiliation was now blooming into the beautiful, terrible flower of poetic justice. Rashad took a slow, deliberate sip of his water. The hammer hadn't even dropped yet, and it was already magnificent. Back in New York, CEO Alistair Finch stood amidst the wreckage of his company's morning. He looked at the viral videos playing on one screen, the sea of red alerts on another, and finally, at the calm, powerful face of Rashad Coleman projected on the wall. The two images, the humiliated passenger and the titan of industry, merged into one terrifying reality. He understood that this wasn't about a seat anymore. This was about a reckoning. He grabbed a secure line that patched directly to the cockpit of any plane in his fleet. His voice was strained, stripped of all its usual command and replaced with a raw, desperate urgency. He keyed in the flight number. "This is Finch," he said, his voice cracking. "Get me the captain of Flight 287. Now." There was a pause, and then the captain's voice came on the line, confused. "Sir, we're still grounded. We have no idea what." Finch cut him off, his voice a ragged shout. "Listen to me. You will not move. You will not speak to the passengers. You will do nothing until you hear from me again. Whatever happens, do not take off." On Flight 287, time had become a thick, gelatinous substance. Minutes stretched into an hour, then two. The nervous energy in the cabin had curdled into a foul mixture of frustration and fear. The air, once cool and crisp, was now stale and heavy with the scent of anxiety. For the passengers, the luxury of first class had become an elegant prison. The initial whispers of annoyance had escalated into loud, entitled complaints. A man in a pinstripe suit, who had chuckled during the initial confrontation, was now demanding to be let off the plane, threatening to call his lawyer. A woman on her way to a wedding in New York was quietly weeping. They were all trapped, united in their powerlessness. But as the chaos mounted, Rashad Coleman sat in a bubble of perfect, unnerving calm. He was the eye of the hurricane, the still point around which a multi-billion-dollar corporation was tearing itself apart. And then, his phone buzzed. The sound, a low, electronic vibration, cut through the cabin's agitated murmur. Every head turned. In a plane where all communication with the outside world had been severed, a single active device was an anomaly, a sign of power. It was a secure, encrypted video call, routed through a satellite connection that bypassed the plane's disabled Wi-Fi. The caller ID was not a name, but a corporate insignia, the stylized eagle of Atlantic Crest's executive leadership. This was an airport security. This wasn't the captain. This was the king, calling from his crumbling castle. Rashad answered. The face that appeared on his screen was that of Alistair Finch, the CEO of Atlantic Crest Airlines. He looked haggard, his usually immaculate silver hair disheveled, his tie loosened as if he'd been fighting for air. Behind him, the serene corporate backdrop of his office was replaced by a conference room of terrified executives scrambling in the background, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dread. "Mr. Coleman," Finch began, his voice a desperate, fumbling rush. "Mr. Coleman, my God, on behalf of the entire Atlantic Crest family, we are so profoundly sorry. There's been a terrible, terrible mistake. A complete breakdown of our values. We had no idea. We didn't realize." Rashad cut him off. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply spoke with the cold, precise finality of a judge delivering a verdict, his voice an anchor of calm in a sea of panic. "No, Mr. Finch," he said, his voice level and clear enough for the rows nearest him to hear every word. "You didn't realize. That isn't the mistake. That's the problem." Finch was silenced. He had been prepared for shouting, for threats, for lawsuits. He had a team of lawyers just off-screen ready to manage that kind of outburst. He was not prepared for this icy, surgical composure. This wasn't a man demanding an apology. This was a man conducting an autopsy. "Let's not waste time talking about my feelings," Rashad continued, his tone shifting from that of a passenger to that of a CEO assessing a catastrophic business failure. "Let's talk about your data. In the last 3 hours, your brand has suffered what can only be described as an extinction-level event. There are currently 1.7 million unique mentions of the hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack tied directly to your airline's name. A headline in Forbes, which went live 20 minutes ago, is calling this the most expensive act of racism in corporate history. Your stock is down 9% in pre-market trading. That isn't emotion, Mr. Finch. That is a quantifiable disaster." He paused, letting the words sink in, watching the blood drain from Finch's face. In the background of the call, Rashad could see the PR chief, David Chen, bury his face in his hands. "Furthermore," Rashad went on, his voice unwavering, "your entire global operations are currently offline. Not because of a technical failure, but because your crew on this aircraft made a decision based on their discretion. As of this moment, that decision is costing your shareholders approximately $70 million per hour in lost revenue, airport fees, and operational costs. This is not a complaint. This is a damage assessment. And the damage, I can assure you, is escalating." While Rashad spoke, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew even more charged. Passengers, seeing him on a calm video call while they were all trapped, began to understand that something extraordinary was happening. This wasn't a standard delay. The man they had watched being humiliated was now, somehow, in control. Their whispers shifted from annoyance to awe, tinged with a new kind of fear. The flight attendant who had started it all, the young man with the arrogant smirk, now stood frozen near the galley, his face ashen. He was visibly trembling, his eyes wide with a dawning, sickening comprehension. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had lit a fuse connected to a bomb, and it had just detonated in the hands of his CEO. His career wasn't just over. It was a crater. And then there was Ethan Prescott, the VIP. He was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a linen napkin that was now soaked through. He could hear every cold, calculated word from Rashad's side of the conversation. Quantifiable disaster, damage assessment, $70 million per hour. He was a board member. He understood exactly what those words meant. He was staring at Rashad, not with the smug superiority of before, but with the terrified reverence of a man looking at his executioner. He had finally pieced it all together, The rival CEO, the massive $400 million joint venture deal he was actively trying to sabotage, the critical infrastructure contract. He hadn't just taken a man's seat. He had kicked a hornet's nest the size of a planet, and in doing so, handed his rival all the leverage in the world. Rashad brought his attention back to the screen, to the shell-shocked face of the CEO. But your biggest problem isn't the PR, or the money, or the operational paralysis, he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming even more intense. Your biggest problem is systemic. It's a cultural rot, and I have the data on that, too. This was the blow they never saw coming. Through my company's long-standing partnership with yours, I am aware of certain internal metrics you prefer not to share in your annual reports. I know, for example, that your company commissioned a third-party diversity and inclusion audit 18 months ago, an audit which you never made public, because it concluded that your internal promotion track for Black employees was, and I quote from page 47, statistically non-existent and indicative of institutional bias. I know that in the last fiscal year, over 200 formal discrimination complaints were filed by your employees, and 94% of them were dismissed by HR with no disciplinary action, often with a note lacks cultural context. I know you have exactly one Black woman in a senior vice president role, and you trot her out for every diversity panel while denying her any real operational authority or budget. He leaned closer to his phone's camera, his eyes boring into Finch. What happened to me today wasn't random. It wasn't a mistake made by one or two bad apples. It was the predictable result of a corporate culture you have built and fostered. A system that teaches your employees that a white man in a cashmere sweater is a VIP and a Black man in a suit is a problem to be managed. You don't have a delay, Mr. Finch. You have a system built on ignorance, and your system is no longer working. Alistair Finch looked utterly broken. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The apologies, the excuses, the promises, they all died on his lips, rendered meaningless by the cold, hard data of his own company's failures. He had been so focused on the man, he had never considered that the man might know the machine better than he did. The vindication in the air was thick enough to taste. For every person who had ever been followed in a store, passed over for a promotion, or told they didn't belong, this was the moment. The oppressor, so confident in his power just hours before, was now terrified, exposed, and utterly silent. Rashad Coleman had reclaimed his dignity not by shouting, but by holding up a mirror and forcing a corrupt system to look at its own reflection. The quiet resistance had become a corporate reckoning. But it wasn't over yet. The power had shifted, but justice had not yet been served. Rashad looked at his watch, a silent, deliberate gesture that screamed of control. He let the silence on the call stretch, forcing Finch and his team to sit in the wreckage they had created. He could see them squirming, looking at each other, desperate for a way out. There was no way out. There was only a way through. You and your board have created this problem, he said, his voice now calm, decisive, and utterly dominant. He was no longer assessing the damage. He was dictating the terms of surrender. He saw the flicker of relief in Finch's eyes, the pathetic hope that this could be solved with a simple check and a handshake. Rashad extinguished that hope immediately. You have 1 hour, he said, his voice as cold and final as a tomb. 1 hour to convene your board, review the data I just shared with you, and decide if what happened on this plane today was a mistake you can apologize for or a lesson you are willing to learn from. Your next actions will determine which it is. And be assured, the world is watching. The 60 minutes that followed Rashad's ultimatum were the longest and most expensive in the history of Atlantic Crest Airlines. In the New York boardroom, the forced composure of the executive shattered, replaced by a frantic, high-stakes panic that bordered on hysteria. Lawyers shouted into phones about invoking force majeure clauses, only to be reminded by their own terrified counsel that their clients' actions had initiated the crisis. The COO argued for calling the government, for claiming it was a national security threat, a hostile cyber attack. Brand managers stayed blankly at screens showing their company logo, once a proud symbol of American aviation, now engulfed in a firestorm of digital hate. The board members, The titans of industry who were used to shaping the world with quiet phone calls were reduced to frightened old men, staring at the impassive face of a CEO who held their entire empire in his hand. They debated, they argued, they looked for an angle, a loophole, a countermove. But there was none. Every path they explored led back to the same terrifying conclusion: total, unconditional surrender. Rashad Coleman hadn't just shut down their servers. He had cornered their king, and the board was in checkmate. With every tick of the clock, their stock bled in after-hours trading, their reputation crumbled, and their legal exposure grew exponentially. They weren't in a negotiation. They were in a hostage crisis of their own making, and the ransom was their pride. 52 minutes after Rashad had ended the call, his phone buzzed again. It was Alistair Finch. The arrogance was gone. The desperation was gone. All that remained was the hollowed-out shell of a man who had been utterly and completely defeated, a general offering his sword to the conquering hero. "Mr. Coleman," Finch said, his voice a dry rasp, heavy with the weight of his humiliation. "The board has agreed. We are ready to learn." "Good," Rashad replied, his voice devoid of triumph. It was the voice of a man executing a plan. "The first lesson is transparency. You are going to issue a public statement. Not another pathetic excuse about a misunderstanding. You are going to tell the truth. You will state that a black passenger was racially profiled by your crew. You will state that your internal culture failed him, and by extension, all of your customers. You will apologize, not for the delay, but for the deep and systemic discrimination that this incident has exposed. Your PR team will draft it, but my team will approve the final text. You have 10 minutes. On board Flight 287, the passengers were nearing a breaking point. But then, something shifted. It started with a single chime, then another. Phones that had been useless bricks for hours suddenly lit up, reconnecting to the world. News alerts, push notifications, and social media feeds exploded back to life with a synchronized fury. A collective gasp went through the cabin as passengers read the headlines. It wasn't a memo. It was a confession. Atlantic Crest Airlines had just released a public statement admitting to an act of systemic bias and racial profiling on Flight 287, apologizing directly to the unnamed passenger, and promising immediate and sweeping reforms to their corporate culture. The truth spread through the plane like lightning. The whispers, the glances, the shared screens, it all pointed to one person. The quiet, composed man in the back of the first-class cabin. He hadn't just been a victim. He was the cause of all of this. He was the one in charge. The man who had chuckled during the confrontation was now staring, his mouth agape, at the man he had dismissed. While the passengers were still processing, Rashad's call with Finch continued. The CEO's voice was now barely a whisper as he listened to the non-negotiable terms of his company's survival. "Second," Rashad stated, his voice as sharp as a scalpel, "Ethan Prescott." He glanced a few rows ahead to where the VIP was sitting, his face a ghastly shade of gray. Prescott flinched as he heard his name spoken, a jolt running through him. His actions today represent a catastrophic failure of governance. A board member who uses his position to gratify his own prejudice is a liability you can no longer afford. He will tender his resignation, effective immediately, and you will announce that his departure is part of your new commitment to corporate integrity. That is non-negotiable. Third, Rashad continued, his gaze shifting to the crew cowering near the galley, the employees involved, the supervisor, and the 2 flight attendants. Their actions were not a mistake. They were a choice to enforce a prejudice. They are the face of the rot you allowed to grow. Their employment with Atlantic Crest is terminated today, and this action will also be made public as a signal to every one of your thousands of employees that there are real-world, career-ending consequences for this kind of behavior. The era of hiding behind discretion is over. The young flight attendant who had initiated the confrontation finally broke. A quiet, choked sob escaped his lips. He leaned against the galley wall, his face buried in his hands, a portrait of broken arrogance and the devastating arrival of consequence. Finally, Rashad said, delivering the masterstroke, "This cannot be solved with firings and apologies. This is about rebuilding. You will agree to a full, independent, and public audit of your company's hiring, promotion, and HR practices to be conducted by a firm of my choosing. We will expose the rot to the sunlight, and you will establish a $10 million fund administered by that same firm to create scholarships and executive training programs for Black professionals in the aviation and technology sectors. Accountability isn't about punishment, Mr. Finch. It's about correction. On the other end of the line, there was only the sound of Finch's ragged breathing. He knew he had no choice. This wasn't a negotiation. It was the price of survival. We agree. He finally choked out. We agree to all of it. Then you have chosen to learn your lesson, Rashad said. He made a final, quiet statement, a line that would be quoted on every news network for weeks to come. Accountability isn't revenge. It's correction. He ended the call. A moment later, he sent a single, encrypted command from his phone. Across the country, in the operations center of Atlantic Crest Airlines, the wall of red alerts flickered and then, one by one, turned green. The system was back online. On Flight 287, the engines began to hum, the powerful sound vibrating through the cabin. The lights, which had been dimmed, returned to their full brightness. The ordeal was over. As the realization dawned on the passengers, a strange and wonderful thing happened. A woman in the front row began to clap. Then another passenger joined in. Soon, the entire first-class cabin was filled with a wave of quiet, respectful applause. It wasn't for the airline. It was for the man who had brought a corporate giant to its knees without ever raising his voice. The flight attendant who had humiliated him couldn't even look in his direction. He stood by the galley, his head bowed in shame, waiting for the inevitable moment when the captain would inform him he was no longer an employee. The victory was complete. The catharsis was deep and satisfying. Every news channel in the country had broken away from their regular programming, the chyron blazing across the bottom of every screen. The man who grounded an airline. Justice, it seemed, had been delivered. But as the plane finally began to taxi toward the runway, Rashad's work wasn't quite finished. The corporate reckoning was over, but the personal one was just beginning. He looked over at Ethan Prescott, who sat hunched in seat 1A, a broken and terrified man, now stripped of his power, his prestige, and his purpose. Rashad's expression was no longer cold or composed. It was something new, something unreadable, and far more terrifying. His final move, the one that had nothing to do with servers or stock prices, but with a $400 million deal and a personal slight, had not yet been revealed. Justice can be a single, explosive moment, a verdict delivered, a battle won. But real change is quieter. It's a ripple that spreads from a single act of defiance, slowly but surely reshaping the shoreline. In the week that followed the grounding of Flight 287, the world didn't just talk about what happened. It began to change because of it. On cable news, the conversation was relentless. Pundits who had spent years debating hypotheticals now had a case study in real-world consequences. What Rashad Coleman did was expose the myth of meritocracy, one analyst said, her voice resonating in millions of homes. He proved that you can build the system, you can excel in the system, and the system can still fail to see you. News headlines no longer focused on the delay, but on the impact. The Coleman correction, how one CEO forced a reckoning on corporate bias. Across the country, in boardrooms that had nothing to do with aviation, a new kind of fear had set in, the fear of a similar reckoning. Competitors of Atlantic Crest were frantically rewriting their customer service policies. Tech companies were reviewing their own diversity audits, suddenly terrified of what a disgruntled partner might expose. Rashad's stand had become a catalyst. The movement wasn't just top-down. It was bubbling up from below. On professional networks, Black employees, from pilots to software engineers, began posting a simple, powerful message. We see you, Rashad. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a digital nod of solidarity from thousands of people who had endured their own versions of the Flight 287 experience. They had been told they didn't belong, their credentials questioned, their presence treated as a surprise. Rashad's victory was their victory. His silence was their voice. And what of Rashad's final, silent move? The world watched as Atlantic Crest followed through on every demand. The crew was fired. Ethan Prescott was unceremoniously scrubbed from the company's board of directors, a pariah in the world that had once worshipped him. The $10 million fund was established. But the fate of the $400 million joint venture, the deal Prescott had tried to sabotage, remained a mystery. The media speculated that Rashad would use his immense leverage to kill the deal, to exact a final pound of flesh from his rival. But they were wrong. Revenge was never the point. Correction was. 1 week later, the deal was signed. But the terms had been rewritten. Rashad hadn't just secured a larger share for Nextech. He had inserted a new, legally binding provision never before seen in a contract of this scale, a dignity clause. It mandated that the partner company adopt the same radical transparency and anti-bias protocols that he had forced upon the airline. It linked executive bonuses directly to DEI metrics. It made a safe and respectful workplace a non-negotiable condition of the partnership. He hadn't just won the game. He had changed the rules for everyone who would play after him. That was his silent legacy. Through it all, Rashad himself remained a ghost. He declined every interview request, from the biggest networks to the most prestigious newspapers. The world wanted to hear him gloat, to see him take a victory lap. But he denied them the performance. Instead, he released one final, written statement. It was just 10 words long, but it landed with the force of an earthquake. Dignity doesn't need an announcement. It needs protection. The closing scene of this chapter of his life took place exactly 1 week later, back where it all began, LAX. As Rashad Coleman walked through the polished terminal to catch another flight, the atmosphere was different. There were no confrontations, no challenges. This time, everyone recognized him. Heads turned. Phones were lowered, not to record a humiliation, but out of respect. A black skycap gave him a slow, proud nod. A gate agent met his eyes and offered a small, genuine smile. They saw him now, but Rashad didn't look back. His eyes were fixed forward, on the next destination, the next challenge. He had forced the world to see him, but he didn't need their recognition to know who he was. What happened on Flight 287 was never just about one man or one seat. It was about a system that reserves its respect for a select few and its suspicion for the rest. It's a story that plays out every day in ways both big and small. But Rashad Coleman proved that sometimes all it takes is one person's refusal to be diminished to shake that system to its very foundation. It leaves us with a question we all have to answer. When a man who built the system is treated like he doesn't belong in it, maybe it's time to rebuild the system itself. If you've ever been judged before you even had a chance to speak, this story is for you. Don't just watch what's happening in the world. Stand with us. Like this video to stand for respect. Share it to start a conversation. And subscribe to join our movement, ensuring that no voice is ever silenced again.